All right, you have your intro material, 2 pages. Narrowed everything down. If you hadn't noticed, last time I handed out 1st and 2nd Samuel, so the intro is for both books. Not just want to combine them together because they were combined. And you should have both outlines for 1st Kings and 2nd Kings. And next week we will do 2nd Kings. We're also going to combine Chronicles with 2nd Kings. We'll talk about that a little bit tonight. And we're not going to get too in depth with Kings either. I mean, we could study every single one, but we don't have the time. So we will overview them tonight, talk about some of the major ones. All right, I want to go back and review a little bit. So we're going to go back and look at 2nd Sam. We sort of got cut off last week a little bit. We're going to talk about the decline of David. So I want to go back and review that a little bit. And again, we combine the two together. When we started to look at them, we talked about, going back to 1 Samuel, that it was a book of transitions, and there are several transitions that happened. 3 key ones that happened in regards to the national leadership. We talked about the transition from Eli to Samuel, and then the transition from Samuel to Saul. And not all of the transitions are, in a sense, the same. When you go from Eli to Samuel, you go from godless to godly and what have you, but from Samuel to Saul, it wasn't that Samuel was not a godly man or that he was not fulfilling his task. It was because the people were insistent on wanting a king like all the other nations. And then we have the transition, the kingship from Saul to David. And that happens for us in 15:10 through 18:9 of 1 Samuel. And again, it's interesting when you think about that. You have 3 major transitions that happen, all having to do with national leadership and the turmoil that's going to come as a result of that. You know, I mean, we look at the country we're in and we look at them, we have one president for so many years and the influence that he has on the nation and the changes that happen under his watch, and then we transition from someone else with different ideologies and so on, and all the effects and ramifications from that. So these were major transitions for the people. The first one for the better from Eli to Samuel, but not so for transition from Samuel to Saul, but back to Saul and David was a positive transition. And David was, some will talk about the United Kingdom, that Saul was king over United Kingdom, same with David, then Solomon. But really, David is the one who consolidated the kingdom. He's the one who really, truly united it. He's the one who established Jerusalem as being the key city. The ark was brought there. He built his city. He expounded the boundaries. There was peace in the time of David. And then when he passes it on to Solomon, then we have this period of actually just one of the most godly periods really for the nation. But it didn't last too long. But we have the rise and fall of Saul. We looked at the ascending characteristics: choice and handsome, took initiative, spirit equipped. And then the declining characteristics: pride, rebellion, and demon possession. But when we look at David, we see a pattern also, and I don't think that it's parallel to that of Saul, so we have to be careful. But nonetheless, David had his turmoil. And the period of David begins all the way back in 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 1. That's where he is anointed by Samuel. Samuel is sent by God out to David's household. Runs through all the sons, no. And then finally the last one, David, and he's the one who is to be anointed. And his story runs then from 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 1, all the way into 2 Samuel to the end of the book. He will creep in at the beginning of 1 Kings because we have the transition from David to Solomon. But the majority of David's life is contained within 2 Samuel as far as his reign and his influence and all the things that he had accomplished. So we have David's election and exile, 1 Samuel 16:1 through 31:13. We have David's ascension to kingship over Judah, 2 Samuel 1:1 through 3:5. And then we have David's ascension to kingship over Israel, 2 Samuel 3:6 through 5:16. And again, when you think back to the period of Saul when he reigned, there was division in the land in the sense that there was this division and conflict between Saul and David. All right, the people really were starting to admire David more and more. And eventually Saul just knew that David was the one who was going to be the king over the kingdom, and he was going to take it over. But there was this conflict, so it wasn't completely united under one king until David came along. So he really did to establish the nation as a nation. We have David's powerful reign in 2 Samuel 5:17 through 10:19. And then we ended here last time, David's pitiful reign, 2 Samuel 11:1 through 24:25. And I'm not going to walk through all the details because we're pretty familiar with the stories of David's life with Bathsheba and that. And her husband was? So the two main things that happened in regards to David, we look at the period of transition, but there were two major transgressions that stand out in David's life. But when we start in 2 Samuel 1 through 10, we have the triumphs of David. Reigns over Judah, reigns over Israel, expands the boundaries, consolidates the nation, he establishes the nation, and then we get to chapters 11 and 12 of 2 Samuel, and we have the transgressions of David, his adultery, and then murder. Getting Bathsheba's husband out of the way, so that way all will be clear. Nathan confronts him in chapter 12, right? Tells him a little parable, and then David realizes, hey, I'm the one. And then we have 2 Samuel 13 through 24 and the troubles of David, right? Consequences of sin. We can choose our sin, we cannot choose the consequences of our sin. And it's interesting when you look at, and there's just no way to say when and when it won't happen, but there are times when God does, He preserves us from the consequences of our sin. Times, but not every time. And that's in God's hands to as far as when that happens, it doesn't happen. But we have the troubles of David first in his household, and then it's going to filter over into his kingdom. And all of this really stemming from his sinful acts. And these are just the ramifications and consequences of that. So that is the second part of 2 Samuel. 1st and 2nd Kings, just to go back and look at the overall scope, again, getting the big picture. We had the era of formation. We had the foundational books, Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, and then the complementary books, Leviticus and Deuteronomy. They fill in the gaps for us. We have the era of theocracy, in which we have Joshua, Judges, and then Ruth is complementary to Judges. Again, the narrative isn't advanced any further. Ruth's lifetime takes place during the time of the Judges, and much of what happened was the circumstances of her life, and so therefore the story isn't advanced forward any really. And then we come to the era of monarchy, and God's idea of it was really a theocratic monarchy, that God was going to establish a king, and the king was going to be the mediator of the law. And the king was going to be the mediator for God in regards to the people, but God was the one who was going to reign. What the people were looking for was not that, right? Because they asked for God to be out of the picture, essentially because God said, they're rejecting me, right? This is what he said to Samuel, they're rejecting me. That's what's taking place here. And so what they were saying was, we don't want God as our king, we want a man as our king. And they complained and asked, so God finally gave them what they asked for, and they were going to pay the consequences of that. But we have 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings. These are our foundational books, and then 1 Chronicles, and then 2 Chronicles. And these add supplementary material to 2 Samuel and 1st and 2 Kings. And again, we're going to combine 1st and 2 Chronicles when we look at 2 Kings, and we'll look at those all together. So intro to 1st and 2nd Kings. First, the title. So if you want to turn to 1st Kings, and we're going to go through 1st Kings tonight, but I'm just going to intro both of them tonight as far as background material, put them together, but then we'll look at them individually. So we're just going to focus on 1st Kings this evening. And some of this stuff I do cover in the notes, intro material, and some of it not. So, sorry, I can't tell you which one is and which one isn't. I'll just tell you that there are some things that aren't going to be in your notes. So, but title, the books, 1st and 2nd Kings, were so named because they record or interpret the reigns of all the kings of Israel and Judah except for Saul. David's last days are mentioned in 1 Kings 1:1 through 2:12, and then David is going to pass on in chapter 2. Solomon is going to take the reins after that, and he is going to rule. So the bulk of David's life is covered for us in all of 2 Samuel, and then 1 Chronicles 11 through 29. And essentially that's sort of how the Chronicles flow as we look at the different periods and eras of kings that are involved there. In the Hebrew Old Testament, 1st and 2nd Kings were one book and regarded as a continuation of the historical narrative begun in 1st and 2nd Samuel. And really, they were all combined together. So the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, divided Kings into two parts that constitute 1st and 2nd Kings in the English Bibles, and that's where we get our two-part division from. But originally, they were connected together, and they were called 3rd and 4th Kingdoms in the Septuagint, and then 1st and 2nd Samuel referred to as 1st and 2nd Kingdoms. And so you basically have 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th Kingdoms, and in the Russian Bible it's the same way, Tsarstva. They follow the same pattern, which is interesting because even in the Russian Bible, when you look at the Psalms, if you look at our Psalms in the Hebrew text, they don't coincide. The numbering's off. The other thing that's interesting is that if you look at the English Bible and Psalms and then in the Hebrew Bible, the title in the Hebrew Bible is included in verse 1. It's a part of the verse. In ours, it's a separate thing. But the Russian Bible actually coincides with the numbering of the Psalms from the Hebrew text. So there's some things that they got right and some things they didn't get right. The title Kings came from Jerome's Latin translation, which was the Vulgate, which was made about 6 centuries after the Septuagint. Jerome called the books the Book of the Kings. The date, this is tough to figure out. It's Old Testament books, like I say, they're hard as far as background material, fixing dates, fixing authors, and I believe that the author for 1st and 2nd Kings is anonymous. We don't know. Tradition has said it was Jeremiah, but there's problems with holding that view. And it's all right if you do, but there's some difficulty with it. The release of Jehoiakim from prison is the last event recorded in 2 Kings 25, 27 through 30, which dates at 561 BC. Therefore, 1st and 2nd Kings could not have been written before that event. And it seems unlikely that the return of the Jews from the Babylonian captivity in 536 BC had taken place when 1st and 2nd Kings were written, because if it had taken place, it would have been mentioned in Kings, because that's where we're given the deportation, first for the Assyrian captivity and then for the Babylonian captivity, but both of those come from Kings. And so if those events are recorded, then if the return happened before 1st and 2nd Kings were written, then obviously the author would have made mention of that, and they hadn't mentioned that. So that sort of fixed our time period for us as far as when it could be written. So 1st and 2nd Kings were completed in their final form between 561 BC and 536 BC. And, you know, some of this might sort of plague us a little bit when we start thinking about canonicity and should we accept all these books as the Word of God? And I just remind you that when Jesus had discussions with the religious leaders of the New Testament, there was never ever a debate about canonicity. In other words, they never discussed what books belonged in the Old Testament canon. It was already closed by then, and it was affirmed by then. So there was no question about it. Some would suggest later that the Council of Jamnia, which happened after the time of Christ, that the canon wasn't settled, but the Council of Jamnia wasn't dealing with the issue of canonization ultimately. So that's just based on misunderstanding. The author, though, it is obvious that the author utilized various source materials. When you read through 1st and 2nd Kings, it reflects, though, when you look at the material and how it's composed, that it had a single author. When you have one person writing, then they have their intent, their design, their plan, what they're attempting to communicate by the guidance of the Holy Spirit. And so when you read through 1st and 2nd Kings, you see that there is a single author. It isn't a compilation of a bunch of different people. It's interesting. So if you look at, I was just reading a book just recently on postmodernism, and it was a compilation. Each chapter was done by a different author. If you read the different chapters, you realize, without someone telling you or having the titles on the top of each chapter that someone had written such and such a chapter, you would discern that they weren't all written by the same person, because the style of writing is completely different. The way they think is different. The words that they use are different. The process that they go through when they're explaining their thoughts and all that is different. And so you can discern, reading through a single book, that each chapter was written by somebody else. When you read through 1st and 2nd Kings, you realize that only one person has written this compilation. Some of the indicators for this choice are materials recorded, the records of the deeds and evaluations of the kings, the ministries of several prophets, the emphases which run throughout the books, the ministries of the prophets, and the evaluation of the kings in relation to Mosaic law, and the primacy of the Davidic dynasty, the method of expressing the beginnings and endings of the king's reigns, and the phrases and terms that recur from beginning to end. So when you say you study a book of Paul and you see that Paul uses a certain type of phrasing and he uses certain types of idioms, and then you read Peter and he uses different kinds of idioms, you can see that you have two distinct authors. So in this case, when you look through and you see these common phrases, common terms, common idioms, we realize that there is a single author behind the work of 1st and 2nd Kings. Tradition has assigned Jeremiah as the author, and this is according to Jewish tradition. Most authorities prefer the viewpoint of anonymity, and they agree that the writer was a prophet who was captive in Babylon. And I would agree with that. I think that the author of 1st and 2nd Kings is anonymous. I don't think it was Jeremiah. Reason being, when you look at the last event recorded in 2 Kings 561 BC, it's kind of tough to place Jeremiah in that particular positioning because it happened in Babylon. Jeremiah didn't go to Babylon, he went to Egypt. And by the time of the writing, Jeremiah would have been in his 80s. And that I do believe I put into your notes, so you just have that there, 86, I think, total years he would have been. So I don't think that Jeremiah wrote 1st and 2nd Kings, but I'm not going to die on that hill. But
more prophets than just Jeremiah.
yeah. But when you read through the Old Testament, there was school prophets that existed at the time of Samuel, right? Saul went and prophesied with the prophets. So there were prophets, other prophets besides, the key ones that we read about. So yeah, I believe that there was, God utilized someone, but we just don't know who it is. A purpose for 1st and 2nd Kings. First Kings was written to continue the story of the united monarchy under David's son Solomon. It was also writing to record the division of the kingdom into the north and south. And the book is not just a view of historical events, but a commentary on the great spiritual issues of those times, the different events that went on. And again, we see these high highs and low lows, and we just keep going on this roller coaster all the way through the Old Testament, right? Just up and down, up and down, up and down. We find the same thing happening. We come into 1 Kings. We find this height in regards to Solomon and the wisdom and all of that, the kingdom and its positioning, the peace that was there, the expanse of their boundaries. I mean, it's going to state that he reigned all the way down to the border of Egypt. And so here you have this great phase in the life of the nation of Israel, and even Solomon's prayer reflects their obedience to God and so on, but yet it's not going to last long. The story of 1st and 2nd Kings is basically one of failure. Nation passes from affluence and influence to poverty and paralysis. The opening chapters of 1 Kings describes the glory attending Solomon's reign, but by the middle of the book, antagonisms between the 10 northern tribes and the 2 southern tribes begin to split the kingdom in half. There's that constant warfare that's going to go on. And even some tried to foster that just so that they could have their reign. The troubles of the two kingdoms, Israel and Judah, carry over into the narrative of 2 Kings, climaxing in the fall and captivity of both. By revealing the failure of man and human governments, 1st and 2nd Kings point forward. It's looking forward to the coming of the great king, David's son, who's going to be the head, who's going to establish his millennial kingdom and reign. So everything is pointing towards that. If I can present 1st and 2nd Kings for you just to sort of show the progression. 1st Kings, downward spiral, we begin with glory. Glory of Solomon and united kingdom passed on from his father to him. You know, you can do all that you can do as a father and as a parent to pass on positive things, godly things to your children, but there's no guarantee that they're going to carry those things on. We have the rupture that comes of the kingdom, and then we have the consequence, the troubles between the two kingdoms. And again, some of these things we could do it a little more in detail when looking at this layout, but again, just a reminder that when you study books, to look at the book as a whole, as often as we can, set aside the time to read the book from beginning to end in one sitting, and to do that as often as possible. The more that we can do that, the better that we can have an overall perspective of what's happening in a particular book. When we tend to read chapter by chapter, verse by verse, and segment it that way, we fail to see the overall flow and the overall message and the movement that's happening and the direction that's going on. I've carried that even over into other books that I read. There are books like I'll take time and I'll just read through them once without highlighting or marking anything, but I'll read through them to get the gist of the flow, the direction of where it's going. And then I'll go back through it again, and then I'll go back and I'll highlight certain things. Mentally, I might make notes of certain points in different chapters and that, but I'll try to do the same thing even just when I read books ordinarily, to go back and then I'll just highlight and make more details. But it's always good to give that initial perspective on how things move. And if you need to use different translations, you know, if you want to use a little more, NIV is good. You go anything past NIV, it gets a bit murky and watery. But sometimes it helps to do that, you know, when you have one that's not literal, but it's more word for word. We refer to it as a dynamic equivalent translation. Sometimes it's easier to pick up the thoughts. Then you go back and worry about the particular words and the connections and those kinds of things. But that's just a little pragmatic suggestion. 2 Kings, flow begins like this: corruption of the kingdoms, especially Israel, the captivity that comes as a result, again, of Israel, and we're going to find that captivity is going to happen for both the kingdoms. Then we have corruption again of Judah, and then the captivity of Judah. And so this is where 1 Kings sets us. So we had that period of that era of formation. We had the era of theocracy. We have the era of monarchy, and then we're going to have the era of restoration. Kings is going to lead us into the period of exile, from which then comes the era of restoration, when there will be the return under Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah. So that's just the general progression of the two books, 1 Kings, 2 Kings. Just to get a sense of where we go. We have the United Kingdom, and again, you can argue that the kingdom was united under Saul, but not to the point as it was under David. David is the one who really consolidated, but when he handed it on to Solomon, it was a united kingdom. Everything was all well and good, but then we have the division in 931 BC. So we have Saul, who reigns from 1043 BC to 1011. That is when David then picks up his reign. 1011 BC, David, till 971 BC, Solomon. Solomon from 971 BC to 931 BC, and then 931 BC the kingdom divides. We have the northern kingdom, Israel. We have the southern kingdom, Judah. And really it's Judah and part of Benjamin. Benjamin split. So when Paul is giving his pedigree in Philippians 3 and his reference to his relation to the line of Benjamin and that, this was one of the things that would have been in people's minds if they were reading that pedigree, is that they also, part of Benjamin, connected and stayed with Judah. And that was a major deal. So when they split, they hung tight, at least part of Benjamin's tribe with Judah. We have the northern kingdoms taken away in Assyrian captivity in 722 BC. These are crucial dates to know, and they should be listed on your chronology chart that I gave you. But it's always good to just keep putting them wherever you can, because they're good to fix them in your memory. We have the Babylonian captivity of Judah, happens in 3 phases. First one happens in 605 BC, and this is more likely when Daniel and his buddies were taken off. The best of the best were taken. Usually were the wealthy, the more elite of the people were taken. They would be integrated into the system, the political system and all of that. And then you would have, then next comes 597 BC. And then the final is in 586 BC, and this is when Jerusalem was destroyed. And then what would be left now in 586 were the poor and so on. So there wasn't much strength left there when they finally sacked Jerusalem. And then it's out of this captivity here that we have the return that comes. Everyone get that? So my thought was for my chart for kings is that I would do that though when the kingdom splits, is to have the chart like this and then put the kingdoms of the north, kingdoms of the kings of the south, and then their dates that coincide on that. But it depends on if I get time to get around to it. That's my idea. Plant that in your head, Brandon, while you're working on yours. Maybe you can take it over. So essentially what happens is that when we have the captivities that occur, I take you this because we then have put everything in a little bit of a big picture. Get a sense of God's overall plan. This great theologian, talked about him before, Eric Sauer, German. Love his stuff, love his stuff. Don't agree with his view of creation, but everything else is really good. But what he does in the majority of his books is he tries to look, he doesn't do systematic theology. He tries to look at the different doctrines in light of God's great plan, the full scope, and looks at the different movements in there. And he looks at God's plan from different perspectives. So there's different aspects of theology and doctrine that he deals with as he goes through, but just great books. If you can find copies, they're tough to find, but if you can find them, a total of 4 books I believe he has out. And the first one I read was From Eternity to Eternity. It's just good stuff, really good stuff. But I like the perspective of seeing everything as a whole. So just to get a sense of, with the captivity then, what moves Israel into a period of which they've fallen. And this is 2 Kings chapter 25. This initiates a period in which God is going to work. But this is the time that Luke refers to as the time of the Gentiles. And when Zechariah gives a dating framework for his prophecy, he will do it according to a Gentile monarch, when the other prophets will do it according to a monarch either of Judah or Israel, but always according to the nation of Israel overall, where Zechariah is by a Gentile monarch, and then we know that the times of the Gentiles have begun. And it really began with the fall of Israel. And they're taken into captivity. There's going to be Israel's restoration is going to come in Revelation chapter 20, verses 1 through 6 of the millennial kingdom. So that is the big picture. We fit in here in the times of the Gentiles. We have the church age, if you will. We have the gospel age, if you will, in this time frame, but this is where we fit. Romans, Paul talked about the fact that until the filling up of the Gentiles, right? And then when that happens, then God's going to move towards the consummation of his plan. So we are in that period in which there is the filling up of the Gentiles. When that ends, we don't necessarily know, but this is the plan. So this is the overall perspective of what goes on. And I take a literal interpretation of Revelation 20. There's different ways to take it. I take a literal one, and so we were talking about last time, I am pre. We'll talk about where I am as far as the rapture and the return of Christ. I just don't, if you look at chapters 19 and 20 of Revelation, you really can't take it but literal. You have to do some fancy footwork to take it otherwise. And those who are post-mill have to do fancy footwork, and those who are on-mill have to do fancy footwork. If you look at just a simple word, kai in Greek, which is the word and, it can be used of a logical or chronological sequence. And when you look at 19 and 20 of Revelation, kai runs all the way through those two chapters. And it's just a chronological, logical sequence. Logical, when we talk about God's plan, is eternal plan, so it's not a temporal plan, but we tend to think of it in temporal terms. It's a logical plan worked out in time and space. But nonetheless, when you look at 19 and 20, there's that clear ordering, and it walks all the way through there. And so, therefore, just based on that one term by itself, grammatically and syntactically, you can't take it any other way than literally. And it's giving you a clear succession of what is going to happen. So Christ is going to come and establish his millennial kingdom, and he will reign. And that is when Israel will be restored. So that's the overall big picture. Let's look at some key elements. For kings, we have the key word, division. And this is not in your intro stuff, so you might want to write these down. Key chapter 12, the dividing of the kingdom. This comes with who's son of Solomon? He decides to burden the people with taxation, like his father Rehoboam decided not to remove that yoke of burden off of them, and so therefore. Key verses 8:22 through 26 and 12:16. The key characters: Solomon, Rehoboam, Jeroboam, Ahab, Jezebel, Elijah, Asa, and Jehoshaphat. And then geography: the land of Judah and Israel. All right, the outline for 1 Kings, and we're just going to stick with 1 Kings tonight. We have the reign of Solomon over United Kingdom, 1 Kings 1 through 11. And then the early days of divided kingdom, 1 Kings 12 through 22. In the second part, we're just going to look broadly at different kings that are mentioned in 1 Kings as far as the northern and southern kingdoms. So we're going to look at it in a bigger chunk and not so much in detail. I didn't want to spend a whole lot of time looking at every single character running through 1 Kings. We have so many people that are mentioned and play roles, but nonetheless, just keep a broad perspective of it. So, the reign of Solomon over the United Kingdom, 1 Kings 1 through 11. We have Solomon's ascension to the throne. And this comes in chapter 1, verse 1 through 2:11. David did not initiate ahead of time. What he should have done was to establish that Solomon was going to rule and to take his place. And so there was some confusion and upheaval at the beginning. As David neared the age of 70, according to 2 Samuel 5:4, he was weak and infirm, and became clear to all of Israel that a new king needed to come and was going to come to the throne. David had not clearly publicly declared his son to be his successor. He didn't determine who was going to be. Did so in private, but didn't do so publicly, and needed to do that. And so that was going to happen later. So privately, he had promised Bathsheba that Solomon would be the next king. We find this in chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. And this says, Then Bathsheba bowed and prostrated herself before the king. And the king said, Well, what do you wish? And she said to him, My lord, you swore to your maidservant by the Lord your God, saying, Surely your son Solomon shall be king after me, and he shall sit on my throne. So there was that promise that he made to her, but it wasn't publicly declared. And so in the absence of this public declaration, Adonijah was going to step in. And at the time, Adonijah was the oldest son of David. If we look back at 2 Samuel 13, we know that there were other sons that came before Adonijah. Anybody who knew who they were? Absalom and Amnon. Both of those are out of the way at this point. There's one that's mentioned in 2 Samuel 13. More than likely he's already dead by this point, and that's why he's not mentioned. So Adonijah is the one, and he's going to attempt to take over the throne, and we find this in chapter 1. So David is going to have to move, but he's going to have to squelch this. So there was an attempt to squash when David ordered Nathan the prophet, Zadok the priest. He orders them to come, and he wants this public display to be established that Solomon is king. So we find this in chapter 1, verses 32 through 40. Then King David said, "Call to me Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, and Benaiah the son of Jehoiada." And they came into the king's presence, and the king said to them, "Take with you the servants of your Lord, and have my son Solomon ride on my mule, and bring him down to Gihon. Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet anoint him there as king over Israel, and blow the trumpet and say, 'Long live King Solomon.'" So David had to move. He had to squash what was happening with Adonijah. He had to affirm publicly that Solomon was going to reign upon the throne. So there was some conflict at the beginning. But again, David was going to affirm Solomon as ruling. Considering the potential for chaos and unrest, transition went fairly smoothly after giving a new king some good advice. Israel's greatest, King David, died. And he gave some good advice to Solomon. And we find that Solomon's going to carry that out in chapter 3. But basically, he wanted him to make sure that he had a good foundation to work off of in his kingdom. And so Solomon's going to go through and eliminate a few people. So we move from chapter 2, verse 12 to 434, Solomon's establishment of the kingdom. We have the death of David that happens in the end of chapter 12, the transition that's going to come. If you notice, and in your NASB, I think they have it all titled, but in chapter 12, starting in verse 19, we have Adonijah executed. We have Joab executed in the same chapter. Starting in verse 28, we have Shimei executed. So basically, David's like, look, you got to go in there and you got to make sure that there are no rivals. There isn't. You need to establish your kingdom and make sure that you have a good foundation to work off of. And this was solid advice, wise advice from David. So Solomon was going to go and do as his father had suggested. So after removing several of his adversaries, Solomon put together a highly organized empire. Several things that Solomon had accomplished. He had made numerous political alliances. One of them we see reference in chapter 3 in the first few verses. Then Solomon formed a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her to the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. And later we're going to be told that his reign, Solomon's reign, extended all the way down to the border of Egypt. And so part of what he did, and the reason why he had so many wives, many of them were a result of these alliances that he was making to help establish his kingdom. So he made numerous political alliances. He engaged in many building projects, one of them being the temple, the other being his house. He was also going to build the wall. David had expanded the boundaries, and so Solomon was going to make sure that everyone was safe. He fortified the defenses of Israel. So in one sense, he was following in the footsteps of his father, that he was establishing the nation. It was a great force and power in the time of Solomon. And then he developed a complex bureaucracy. Solomon's wisdom given to him by God in chapter 3. We have Solomon's prayer that starts in chapter 3, verse 6. God's answer comes in chapter 3, verses 10 and following. The interesting thing, though, is if you read before this, Solomon's already referred to by his father as being a wise man. So already he had reflected, at least in David's eyes, that he had some wisdom, he had capability as far as being a leader. David's going to challenge him to step up and be a man, are essentially his words to him. He said, become a man. And then he followed that by talking about his commitment, challenging him to be committed to the Word of God and walking in obedience to that, which I find that very fascinating. You know, oftentimes in our minds as men, we define manhood, but a lot of times it's by how the world defines what manhood is, right? I love John Wayne, and my boys love watching John Wayne Westerns, but there's more to being a man than just John Wayne. So David, with Solomon's wisdom, became well known throughout the region. The nation experienced peace and prosperity. One, because God's favor was obviously upon them, but also David's military victories had established some peace, gave him a foundation which he passed on to Solomon, and Solomon's wisdom and ruling. And many have heard about Solomon's wisdom and his capabilities as far as being a leader. Solomon's building program starts in chapter 5, verse 1, all the way through chapter 10, verse 29. Chapter 5, we have the preparations for what is to come for the building of the temple, and that's going to then come in chapter 6, where he's going to construct it. But David had desired to build a house for God. God said, no, your hands are too bloody, too much warfare. He says, I'm going to build you a household, though. God entered into the Davidic covenant with David, establishing that he is going to be, if you will, the lion from which the Messiah is going to come and ultimately going to reign in the millennial kingdom. But he said, your son is going to build me a house. And so Solomon sets out to do that. And it took about 7 years to build a structure with its abundance of gold, silver, marble, fine woods. The temple was one of the wonders of the world. We have somewhat of a layout of what Solomon's temple looked like. We have the altar, the sea of bronze, and then we have the two pillars. As you would enter in, you have the holy place, the most holy place where the ark is, and then we have storerooms. And we have the measurements there. This is sort of a mock of what it would have looked like when Solomon had established it. This was an amazing thing, right? So the people return after their captivity, deportation. They return back to the land. Building takes place. Okay, they're going to rebuild the walls, and Nehemiah is going to help with that. They're going to rebuild the temple and all of that. It's not going to look the same. The young generation's going, yeah, we got our temple. Old generation crying because it looks nothing like the temple that Solomon built. So all we have are mock-ups of it, but I mean, you can only just imagine how amazing this temple must have been with all the gold and the silver and everything that was utilized in the building of this. You had two giant bronze pillars on the front. You had the holy place with the table of showbread, or the bread of presence. You had the 10 golden lampstands, the altar of incense, and you had the most holy place where the Ark of the Covenant was. And then you had storerooms that bordered it. And this is a little bit of a different purview of what it might have looked like, but all of it's just in gold. I mean, just imagine walking into the temple as a priest and just surrounded, you know? I mean, but all of this, I mean, the massive amount of wealth that went into constructing, right? And then you realize that all that time that you know, God's glory, this was his meeting place with his people. And then Ezekiel, the glory departs and not to return until later. So the high point in Israel's history in Old Testament really is during this period. With Solomon, his prayer indicates that in chapter 8, we have the dedication of the temple and his prayer to the Lord. And so many of the things that he references reflects the spiritual condition of the people. This was truly a high point for them. And these were days in which they were walking in accord with the will of the Lord. They were walking according to his law. Perfect, no, but nonetheless, this was a high point in regards to their history. Never again do we find the nation as a whole living in such peace and prosperity, and apparently so completely devoted to Yahweh as this period right here. It's what makes the downfall just so horrific, right? I mean, and again, just to see man's sinfulness and how it can degenerate. Both king and people were united in obedience to the law of Yahweh during this period. And we find this again in Solomon's prayer in chapter 8. There's just so much, just some time in your own, read back through Solomon's prayer in chapter 8. There's just so much rich theology there. But it was a good reflection of the condition that the people were in. Then we have Solomon's spiritual failure and end as Israel's king, and starts in chapter 11, verse 1 through verse 43. His son's going to take over in chapter 12. The kingdom's going to be divided. death of Solomon is recorded for us at the end of chapter 11, starting in verse 41 through verse 43. Two passages that we've already looked at that are key in regards to this period in Solomon's life, and I take you back to them. The first was in 1 Samuel chapter 8. People kept begging for a king. God said, fine, give them what they asked for. They want to be like all the other nations. They want to reject me, and they want their own human king. Well, then give them a king after their own heart, not my own heart. And so that's exactly what happened. Samuel warned them, and then nonetheless, right, chapter 8, nevertheless, they still said, give us a king. We hear you, Samuel, but we're not hearing you. God warned Israel that heavy taxation would accompany the monarchy. In order to maintain his huge government, luxurious lifestyle, and numerous building projects, Solomon turned more and more to the taxation of the people. So they were warned about it in 1 Samuel chapter 8, and now it was coming to fruition in regards to Solomon. Taxation caused deep unrest and became terribly oppressive. And Rehoboam had the opportunity to remove that burden, that yoke from them. Notice with me in chapter 12, verse 4, your father made a yoke hard. Now therefore lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke which he put on us, and we will serve you. And he had opportunity, and he listened to his friends and did not take advantage of that. He was not wise, and so therefore suffer the consequences. But all of this was set in motion by Solomon. It wasn't just Rehoboam. All of this was put in the process by Solomon, and this was the coming of the end for that. Deuteronomy 17 was the other passage we looked at. God warned kings not to multiply horses, silver, and wives. The horse was the base of military might, but Yahweh wanted Israel to trust him. Silver and all the forms of wealth would breed independence from Yahweh, and so therefore they weren't to accumulate great wealth for themselves. And again, they weren't supposed to do it on the backs of the people. Many wives, often part of the treaties that we saw in chapter 3, which many of the wives that Solomon had, were a result of him establishing alliances and expanding his power. Even though the border didn't, or the boundaries didn't move as far as the kingdom, nonetheless his influence and the power that he had was a result of these alliances that he had established through marriage. But the warning was that you accumulate these women from other peoples. They're going to bring in their idols, their spiritual influence, religious influence, and they're going to corrupt the king. And that is exactly what happened with Solomon. Challenged his devotion. So Solomon violated all three of these prohibitions when we look at the record of his life. And that is what set the stage for the decline in regards to the kingdom. So Solomon antagonized his subjects. Solomon offended the Holy One of Israel, Yahweh. Solomon's devotion to the idols of his many wives brought a word of judgment from God in chapter 11, verses 11 through 13. Solomon's sin resulted in the division of the kingdom. Solomon's son would be king over but 2 tribes, and only the existence of the Davidic covenant kept Solomon from being cut off. So what turned from a very high time in regards to the nation of Israel became a very low one as a result of Solomon. The other kings, author of 1 Kings, quickly passes from Solomon. He's going to run through the different kings that are going to reign in regards to the northern and southern kingdoms. There's some focus on Jeroboam. He's a central figure in the monarchy period. Jeroboam, a servant of Solomon, will become the first king of the northern kingdom, chapter 11, verses 26 through 31. In the early days of the divided kingdom starts in 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 22. We have the division of the kingdom, 12:1 through 20. Solomon did not follow in his father's steps by failing to clearly set up a successor. He had set up Rehoboam ahead of time and established that he was to be the king, his successor. After his father's death, Rehoboam went to Shechem in the north, central Israel, and he was going to establish the kingdom there, unite the kingdom. It was then that the people demanded relief from the burden that his father had placed on them. He did not relieve that burden from them, and so therefore there was a split that came as a result of that. And unfortunately, he listened to his youthful friends rather than to wise counsel, and therefore he brought about the conflict that would come. Although Rehoboam's lack of wisdom brought about division in the kingdom, it was not the main cause of it. First and foremost was the spiritual defection of Solomon. To follow other gods in any sense was to deny the covenant with Yahweh and to make a new temple a farce. And when you think about this high point, he's the one who built the household of God. He built this residing place for the Shekinah glory. Offers up the prayer that he does in chapter 8, and then his allegiance to God is going to wane because of his wives. This is by itself was enough to bring God's judgment upon the nation. There was a long-standing tribal jealousy that was promoted by Judah's being in the preeminent kingly tribe. Solomon deepened this jealousy by several things. First, taxing all the tribes but Judah, concentrating his building projects in Judah, emphasizing the defense of Judah, and in his harsh treatment of central northerners by offering to give away their cities to the other king. So there was much that Solomon did to foster not just his sinfulness, but even just the way that he reigned and the way that he dealt with the kingdom overall. Solomon's exploitation of the people. And then we have, in light of this, the powerful forces at work and division that came would continue for the next 210 years. So once the kingdom split, there was just nothing but conflict. There was perpetual civil war. I mean, we've had civil war, but not like they had civil war. The year of division was in 931 BC. The histories of the two kingdoms are interwoven in the scripture until the captivity of the northern in 722 BC, 2 Kings 17. So essentially these are the dates when we look at the reigns that happened in the United Kingdom from 1043 BC to 931 BC. And again, that we use the term united loosely with Saul. It wasn't consolidated until the time of David, but nonetheless there wasn't this kind of conflict that took place. The divided kingdom in 931 BC, 722 BC, and then the surviving kingdom 722 BC through 586 BC. Then we have Rehoboam of Judah and Jeroboam of Israel. Although there was political division, the two kingdoms were still religiously united. Jerusalem was still the center of Israel's worship and religious activity. This to me is just, yeah. Jeroboam is not a pleasant individual. We start to find out about him starting in chapter 12, verse 16 and following, but Jeroboam reasoned that he would not be able to maintain his this political division if this unity still existed religiously, if there was still that central place of worship, that everyone was still gathering in the same location. So therefore, he knew the only way that he could maintain his reign was to bring greater division. Right? So he wanted to divide the house, or he wanted to divide the kingdom, and so that's what he did. So he perverted the religion of the north to deprive the Jerusalem of its role as the only center of unified worship for the Lord. He took two bulls, placed them at either end of his kingdom, Dan in the north and Bethel in the south. We see this in chapter 12, verse 28 and 29. Notice with me, so the king consulted and made two golden calves, and he said to them, it is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Behold, your gods, O Israel, that brought you up from the land of Egypt. And he set one in Bethel, and the other one he put in Dan. It goes on to tell us the other things that he did. He also changed the religious calendar and the priesthood. Anyone could serve now from any of the tribes. Verse 31 and 32, it says, and he made houses of high places, and he made priests from among all the people who were not of the sons of Levi. Jeroboam instituted a feast in the 8th month and the 15th day of the month, like the feast which was in Judah. And so basically he had changed the religious calendar and he changed the priesthood. And he said anyone could be a priest now. It doesn't have to be from the tribe of Levi. So he polluted everything just so he could maintain his rule. He was so self-oriented, and the destruction of that was very clear. So he polluted the religious system and led the north kingdom corruption and captivity. This was the beginning of the end for them as far as the kingdom up north. Paganism spread. More than 20 times the scriptures called Jeroboam the man who made Israel sin. Rehoboam proved to be an inept and evil king. The glory days of Solomon faded fast during Rehoboam's 17-year reign, and life was made worse by the war between the two kingdoms. And it's interesting, just that the polar opposite. When you look back at when the tribes were heading back to the other side of the Jordan. They were going to establish themselves in the land, right? And the rest of Israel heard about this, that they were setting up this pillar, this altar, and they were thinking they were going to divide us, right? Because now they're making another place to worship. It was so crucial. And God knew this ahead of time in his design. There's going to be one place where I'm going to place my name, and that is going to be the place that you will come and you'll worship me. And that is what was going to help unite the people. And once that divided, then everything started to fall apart. So Kings of Judah and 1 Kings from 15:1 through 24, and then 22:41 through 50. Won't look at all of them, but just a brief thumbnail sketch of some of the kings we find. Abijam. He was first called Abijah in 2 Chronicles 13:1 and 2. Since Abijah means father of the sea, and Abijah, my father is the Lord, may indicate that his name changed because of his sin. We have Asa was a godly king, 15:11, who destroyed the places of idolatry. He walked in the ways of David. Jehoshaphat, good king who obeyed the Lord and made peace with the north. There's so much more to tell about many of these kings, but I'll just leave that to your own reading. It's like I said on Sunday, it's like the first 9 chapters of Proverbs. I'm just whetting the appetite. Kings of Israel in 1 Kings 15:25 and 22:40, and then 51 through 53. If Nadab, evil like his father Jeroboam, was on the throne for a short time. We have Baasha was a sinful king who ruled after completely destroying everyone in the family of Nadab. It's amazing how power corrupts, isn't it? And you read about the kings and queens of England and all the backstabbing and all that stuff that went on. It was going on long before they ever came on the scene. Eliah continued in the sins and policies of Baasha, his father, during his short reign. We also have Zimri, who's mentioned. Powerful general in the army who assassinated Elah and all of his family so that he could take control. Omri, another leader from the army who came to power after killing Zimri. He was forced to rule alongside another claimant to the throne, Tibni, for 3 years, and these two reigned until Omri won out. Omri was responsible for moving Israel's capital to Samaria and strengthening Israel's alliances, one such bringing the evil Jezebel to Israel. And again, it's nice to remind you, 1st, 2nd Chronicles give us so much added extra material for a lot of these. So those are good books, complementary books that we have that we'll look at next week. But we have Ahab, ruled for 22 years with his wife Jezebel. He brought Israel to its lowest spiritual level. Baalism became the religion of the north, and the scriptures declare that they were the wickedest rulers in the entire history of the north. How'd you like to have that title? So someone is called a Jezebel. It's not a good thing. In order to deal with this extreme crisis, God raised up the fiery prophet Elijah. He was used to counter the evil Baalism and to call some of Israel back to the Lord again. Ahaziah, son of Ahab, and Jezebel was wicked like his parents and ruled for 2 years. And that brings us to the close of 1 Kings. Next week we'll come back, we'll look at 2 Kings and also look at Chronicles along with 2 Kings. And then I want to take some time, we'll look at the prophets, and we'll look at every single prophet. I will give you background to all the prophets, so you'll have an introduction to all the prophets and an outline, but we'll just look at key ones. And I'm thinking I may even just group them together and just walk through key aspects of the prophets. And then we'll move to a period of restoration. And then I'll give you material on books like Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, the poetical books. We won't go through them, but I'll compile material for that so that you'll have that. But I won't make that part of the survey as far as covering those. They don't really carry on the flow too much. Although it's interesting, not some years back when I was teaching with a brother, Frank Pass. It's an interesting thought because he came to me and he said, have you ever heard anyone suggest that Psalms was compiled in regards to a chronological order of the life of David? And I've never heard that before, but when he said that to me, it's always stuck in my head, and I don't see it, but it's an interesting thought that somehow whoever compiled, over the years as they compiled the Psalms, the Psalter, that they did in regards to the chronology of David's life. But